Hey guys, and welcome to Mastering Lighting Lesson 2. As this is an early lesson, and I've already put plenty of V-Ray related content out, I thought I'd use this lesson as an opportunity to demonstrate the power of Octane, break down its interface, and how I personally work with it to finish a product visualization project. Now, with that being said, everything in this lesson, apart from the way the shaders look, can technically still be achieved in V-Ray or V-Ray RT. The results will be slightly different, but it's not like it's impossible to translate the theory and information I'm going to be showing in this lesson. Also, this won't be the last product related lesson done on the course. I'll save a more complex lesson for V-Ray later on. So in this lesson, I'm going to be using HDR Light Studio to light up a Coke can. Now, in any print project, you'll go through a number of changes to achieve the final result. And I originally planned on simplifying things by sticking purely to Octane, and you can see on the left here, this was the very first whip I put out. I probably only spent about 20 minutes trying to light this and get a feel for how I wanted the can to look. And even though for 20 minutes, it's a decent start, for a product visualization shot, it's overly lit. There's too much going on here. There's all sorts of labels and stuff on the can. The can shape is all off. And there's just a lot of problems, but it's a starting point, and you can start to figure out where you want to go from there. So from this point, I tried to minimize the amount of lighting going on in the scene and bring things back to a more simplified look. But what happens when you do that is sometimes you lose a bit of the realism when you try and make too many massive changes in a row. Also, I realized that at this point the camera angle was wrong. You don't get any shape or depth in the can simply because the camera angle is aligned in a way that makes the top of the can pretty much perfectly flat. So from this point, I actually lowered the camera angle, and instead of raising the can to get the bottom reflections in, I had it sitting directly on the floor so that I could get all the reflections from the background reflecting in, and just to make the can look a bit more heroic. So if I zoom out here, this is just the raw render. And you can see that, from Octane, there's a lot of problems like the floor's not really reflecting up. And because the base of the can is actually metallic, I had to go in and render a separate pass to get the base of the can looking good, which I'm going to explain in this lesson how to do. But also at this point, I realized that the lighting would need to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, and instead of trying to take away from the logo, which is the most important part in a product visualization shot, trying to emphasize the cleanliness of that logo, I tried to mix things up a bit and go in a different direction. And that's where one of the users on the course actually helped me out. His name's Tim Harding. He's a product visualization photographer, and he suggested just going with a more simplified look by creating some gradient lighting on either side of the can just to accentuate the shape without overshadowing too much of the logo. So from there, I actually went forward into the retouching phase and just started to clean the render up. If you just let me get rid of that, you can see at this point it's looking okay, but once again I was not really happy with how flat the can was looking. But also one of the biggest problems I realized is that I'd simply been staring at it too much. And this is where on a project that's simple, like a Coke can, it's very easy to overthink things and get stuck in one direction. And once you go down that path, it can be very hard to kind of undo the idea that you've got stuck in your head of what you want the can to look like. So one of the first problems I noticed at this point was that there was too much red in the actual image itself. The background's red, the can's red, and because of that, it's very hard to achieve realism. So at this point, I actually started recording the lesson, and as I was recording it, I realized I wasn't really happy with how things were going. And then at that point, I got extremely sick. I had a couple of different illnesses at the same time, and I couldn't work on anything for a couple of weeks. So sometimes this is a great example of how you can come back without looking at a project for a couple of weeks and just totally rethink how you want to do things. And this is where I've come to the final image that I'm going to teach you how to create in this lesson, where things are a lot more realistic. I've got a bit more of a bit more depth in the can itself. Things are a bit darker, more accentuated, but the logo itself is nice and balanced. You can see the chrome edging isn't blowing out. So around the logo itself, I've gone and made a mask to create a metal edge. And then on the plastic itself, you can also see that's not blowing out, because where the highlights are starting to ping off, you can see it goes slightly above white. So even though it appears like the logo is pure white, one of the most important things to realize is with any visualization is to very finely balance the amount of light you're putting into the scene so things aren't blowing out, to always retain a little bit of that gray value in the white areas, so that when you do have areas like this reflecting over the top, things are nice and finely balanced. So right before the project is finished, I'm just going to go in and address a couple of issues on this image, like the base of the can, and maybe add a couple of highlights to this area here, which you can see is happening on the left side, but we're lacking that on the right. But before I can do any of this, of course, I need to explain to you how Octane works, because I haven't done that yet. I've only really shown you a few little previews of what it's capable of doing. But if you guys follow my Facebook page, you'll know that I absolutely love Octane. It's my favorite render engine to work with, even though if I was working on a production project, 90% of the time you're going to end up using V-Ray, because it's a more powerful render engine and it's a more diverse render engine. But when it comes to just pure photorealism and speed, nothing can really compete with Octane that I've experienced so far. Now, partly the reason for that, obviously, is because I've got two Titan Black video cards in my computer. You know, they're 6 GB graphics cards, and they're just ultra powerful, and they're fairly expensive. But when you factor in how much like a 10-core CPU-based system is worth, it's actually fairly good value for money. So I'm going to scrap this scene and just give you a quick rundown of how Octane works and how to generate shaders in it, because once again, you'll know that in V-Ray, I don't really use the shader node tree. However, in Octane here, if I just bring this over, you can see that it only utilizes, or it's easiest to utilize, the slate material editor when you're working in Octane. Okay, so I've got a scene set up here that I'm going to provide with the lesson, which is just an Octane version of the Mastering CGI Shader Ball scene. So the first thing I've done is in the comment tab, obviously, if you go down to Assign Render Engine, I've just loaded Octane for 3ds Max. Now within Octane, you've got a few different tabs up here, the same as V-Ray, but slightly different. Now the first thing to realize is that Octane can either be a biased render engine or an unbiased render engine. Now a render engine like V-Ray is essentially a biased render engine where you are determining how long you want how many samples you want on the actual image in a much more controlled and touchier way. Whereas Octane's pretty much just like, screw it, just launch as many samples as you want. It's a progressive render, and it's been like that since day one. So they've designed it to work like that. Whereas V-Ray RT, they've kind of had to build that from the ground up over the top of V-Ray, and that's why, even though we're going on now a few years since V-Ray RT has been out, not all the features available in real time are the same as in the production version of the render engine. But the great thing about Octane is it gives you a couple of different options. So by default, the kernel type is a totally biased renderer. So within direct lighting, that's where things are going to be the least realistic, but they're going to be the fastest. Now also you've got path tracing, which is the unbiased version of the render engine, although you can still determine the diffuse and glossy depth, which is quite easy to determine because Octane is a real-time render engine, so you can kind of up or down that depending on how much visual difference you're noticing. And then lastly, you've got the progressive Monte Carlo render engine, which is custom built for Octane to work with GPUs, and this will provide you a much more realistic result when you're dealing with like highly reflective metals or caustics in your scene, like refractive glasses. it's a lot slower to render, but essentially Octane gives you everything you need to create photorealistic renders that are slow to render, or realistic renders that are fairly quick to render. So even though I was sick the last couple of weeks, I wasn't completely unproductive. And one of the things I was working on was David Weaver's Iron Man model. So he was generous enough to share that with me for me to do some testing with, and working on this project just kind of really solidifies why I love Octane. All these shaders are completely procedural except for the dust map over the top. So they're multi-layered shaders, they're extremely complex, but because Octane is real-time, it's so easy to fine control things and get things looking photoreal. So to get started, within Octane and these basic first settings, you need to kind of go in and add some lighting. Now up the top here, you'll notice you've just got your standard render width and height, and you can kind of check what statistics you want in the render engine. But I'm just going to go ahead and open the Octane viewport here, which is the real-time preview. And you'll notice straight away that because I've converted the V-Ray scene to an Octane scene, everything's completely black, and that's simply because there's no lighting in the scene. So if I go to the perspective viewport, just the same as where you'd expect to find V-Ray lighting, if you go to the lighting tab and swap to Octane, you've got a couple of different options. You can either use the Octane daylight system, so if I just drag that in there, you can see instantly things are starting to render. Now once again, I am utilizing both of the Titan Black video cards here, and that's why things are going extremely quick. So I'll just make this full screen here, and it's also important to realize at this point that the reason I've got 3 screens is so I can often just kind of have the Octane viewport off to the right while I'm working inside of the 3ds Max viewport. However, because of obviously the limitations with recording the screen, you guys not being able to see, everything gets a little bit cluttered like this. But essentially, if I go from the camera viewpoint, within the daylight settings, you've got a whole bunch of different options. You can adjust the power, you can manually change the lighting, and you can see how quickly everything updates. Makes it very easy to kind of determine how you want things to look. Now if I just go in and back into the kernel settings, I've got things set up to PMC at the moment. If I swap to direct light, things are going to render faster, but you'll notice straight away there's things lacking, like the diffuse bounces. So you can increase that, and now you notice it kind of starts to bounce up a bit more. So essentially the way I work with Octane is that I'll start with direct lighting. I won't bother wasting my time using path tracing or the PMC render engine because it's just a little bit slower and it doesn't really give you enough of a difference to warrant the slower render time. So I'll stick with direct lighting when I start off things. Now this is only utilizing the Octane daylight. I'm just giving you a quick run through of the different things that are available here. So if I delete that, also you've got the option to go in and use an HDR to light the scene. Now in order to do that, I'll bring over the Slate Material Editor here. And once again, sorry for things getting a little bit cluttered. But what I can do here is if I right click and hit Maps and I go into Octane, similar to the V-Ray options, Octane has its own specific texture formats that you can use. And now to set up an environment, I can go to Texture Environment and just create that simple node there. You've got an option to just use a simple color, but in order for this to actually affect the viewport, you can see it's still rendering black. I need to go into the environment slot, just pull this in over here, and simply just drag that in as an instance. And now we're rendering with just a pure white environment background. So from there, obviously I can just drag out, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use an RGB image, and then I'm going to load an HDR. So I'm just going into one of Jorgen's folders. I'm just going to load the Taras 360 HDR that I've used in a few different other scenes. And you'll notice straight away that everything's completely blown out. So sometimes in Octane, you need to go in and make sure that the gamma and power settings are adjusted so that the HDR is working in a nice and clean way. But the first thing I'll do is, before adjusting the gamma, is drop down the value. And if I bring the gamma back to 1, you'll see we get a much more kind of softer appearance. Now I can bring the power back up. But one of the things lacking in this is, and this is where the power of Octane comes in, because I can change that in real time. If I want things to be more contrasty in the lighting, I can see real time how adjusting that value affects it. And whenever I'm working in Octane, every different scene, and it might be, you know, it's a little bit different to how I work with V-Ray, where I try and keep everything consistent, because in Octane you've got such real-time feedback that I can go in and make small adjustments like this without worrying about things being consistent from scene to scene, because it's just so quick to go in and adjust things to get them exactly how you want. So there you go. I can even go in with the transform and just rotate the HDR, and you can see how that's affecting things real time. You can really find that perfect angle where you want to test how your shaders are looking. And that's just basically how you set up the simple HDR lighting. Now also on top of that, if I just move the Slate Material Editor off the viewport here and these other settings off, you can also go in and make your own custom Octane lights, but they're not that powerful at the moment. For example, when I go in and create an Octane light that's a sphere and drag this out here, you can notice here that the geometry is actually quite low res, and it will reflect. I haven't found a way to get around this so far, but it will actually reflect like it's a low res bit of geometry. And if I actually go into Photoshop here, let me just bring this up. You can see here I've used an Octane light. I don't know if you can tell there, but basically, you know, you can see the banding, at least in the high res you can, the way the geometry is looking. But one thing that's really important to realize in Octane is that by default, every time you change the geometry in the scene, you have to refresh things. Now the reason you have to do that is, and it's just give it a second here, it's just kind of bringing that in, is because by default it doesn't make things movable proxies. So if you go in and right click in the viewport and go into Octane properties, I can make that a movable proxy, and what's going to happen is if I refresh the render geometry button, which is this little green circle here, now when I move things, you can see it's updating in Octane in real time. So it's a little bit slower because it's kind of like caching where the geometry is, but if you ever want to move things, you'll have to go in and turn that option on, because for example here I'm moving this shader ball and you can see there's no change in the scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into the environment tab and turn this off, and now you can see the power of this light here. I can simply raise that, and you know, once again, it's all real time. You just have that perfect option to get things looking exactly how you want. It only takes a second or two to get things really clean. So that's basically the different options you've got within Octane itself. Now in this lesson we are going to be using HDR Light Studio, but I won't show you how to link those two until we go into the actual Coke can scene itself. The last thing I want to show you in this quick preview of Octane is how you work with the shader nodes. So I'm going to bring back the Slate Material Editor here. I'm going to go into Materials, Octane, and I'm just going to create a glossy material. And I'm going to apply that to the ball and the base. Now the interesting thing about Octane is actually utilized the GGX BRDF for a long time now. So part of the reason why I was pushing so hard for V-Ray to use the GGX BRDF is because Octane was doing it for like a year before they'd even considered adding it into the nightly build. And I was getting a lot of benefit in terms of the realism in my shaders in Octane that I just physically couldn't get out of V-Ray because of the lack of that BRDF. And you'll notice here in the highlights, it's doing that nice spread exactly like GGX. Now, one of the recent things you'll realize is that since V-Ray implemented the GGX BRDF, I stopped using the multi-material layer method and simply went to changing the roughness using a fall-off map. And you can do the same exact thing in Octane. So all the theory translates pretty much identically. And I was talking to David Weaver about that on the Iron Man job. And when he took a look at the scene that I sent him back, you know, the settings for the actual render engine itself are a little bit weird, but the way the material's set up is pretty logical and easy to understand. So to show you how the reflection is going to change here, I'm going to make the diffuse go black. Now inside the material, by default, you've just got the Fresnel index. So I can raise this up to say 3, and it's just going to make it look a bit more chrome-like. And now in the roughness, I'm going to drag out a fall-off map. So by default, when you drag out that fall-off map from the roughness slot, you'll notice it doesn't automatically change that. So it's important to realize here that you will need to go in and change the roughness to a actual texture map. Now you can see here the problem with utilizing a fall-off map to change the value is we don't have a black or white value here. So the way we get around that is if I just undrag from here, what I'm going to do is from the roughness is I'm going to drag out a mixed texture, and I'm going to set the texture 1 and 2 to be a color value. And then in the amount, I'm going to swap that to texture. Now what I can do is I can drag the fall-off map into the amount, and I can make the front or the back facing angle perfectly chrome or fully blurry. And vice versa. You see you've got a material preview here. If I make this completely white, the front of the material is going to be really blurry, and then the edges will go cleaner. Obviously that's going to be affected by the fall-off map itself also. So this is where real time I can go in and adjust these settings until they're kind of, you know, looking how I want them to be. So because I don't want the front-facing angle to be perfectly blurry, and it's a little bit different from V-Ray because this is a roughness setting. So the brighter you go, the more rough you're making the material. It's the opposite of V-Ray, where the lower you go, you know, the higher you go on the value, the more glossy it looks. Now also in the same way V-Ray, you can go into the specular and just add a color value to this to get a more metallic look. And because we're doing a coat can, I'll just show you a quick way of setting up something like that type of material. So I'm going to go higher on the index here. I'm going to raise that to 7, and now you can see that that light's having a pretty strong effect. But in order to do a material preview, it's not best to work with a single HDR light. Sorry, with a single point